Everyone. Okay, so chapter 2, constitutional democracy. So in this chapter, we are talking about the basics of the foundation of America's government. So before the Constitution, the colonial, the revolutionary experiences. So remember, this is America under Great Britain, under King George. So there was traditions of limited government and representative government. So limited government is one that is subject to strict legal limits on the uses of power. So at this time, England was under something known as the Magna Carta, which basically limited what the monarchy, the king, could do. Then we also had this idea of representative government, where we saw in Virginia with that House of Burgesses, that first Congress that America had, that was part of that representative government structure. Then we have Americans' British heritage. So again, remember the British were over the Americans. So they did have some experience with democratic institutions. They had the English Parliament, which is kind of like our Congress in that it represents the people, and the colonial charters. We also had the Rights of Englishmen, which is basically the Bill of Rights written under England, another version of it. So the Rights of Englishmen were actually what the American founding fathers, people like Hamilton, Jefferson, Washington, used in order to form our own Bill of Rights. So when America was at war with the French and Native Americans, this created a huge, remember that was that French and Indian War, this created a huge debt for England. So because of that, Britain charged the colonists taxes. But because the colonists did not have parliament representation, they felt that they were being taxed without their consent. Thus, that saying of no taxation without representation. So we have the repeal of the Stamp Act, which remember that's that act that basically put a tax on any type of paper document. So it had a tax on colonial newspapers and business documents. And then we also had the Townshend Act, which included a tax on tea. So why did that matter? So tea to the Englishman was kind of like how coffee is today to us. It's kind of a tradition, right? A lot of people drink it in the mornings, kind of part of their ritual. Tea was the same thing for the colonists at that time period. And then we had that first Continental Congress, that representative Congress, that met in 1774. So the philosophy of John Locke. So John Locke believed in that social contract. Basically, a government must serve its people, and if the people feel like the government is not actually serving them, they have a right to rebel. And that people had inalienable natural rights. That's that life, liberty, and property. Thomas Jefferson kind of used this in his Declaration of Independence when he said, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So you kind of see how these two really relate to one another. He also said all men are created equal. Remember, he was talking about all white men at that time. And that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. That's that social contract. And it's the right of people to alter or abolish it if they feel it's being tyrannical. In other words, if they feel like it's having too much control over them. So, the Articles of Confederation. It's not a constitution per se because it was very limited in what it actually did, but it did set that foundation onto what the founding fathers decided they were going to put into the Constitution. So it was a fundamental law that defines how the government will legitimately operate. So this is basically what the colonists used while they were fighting in the Revolutionary War. It was their own set of laws for them to follow. It created a very weak national government. They were very leery of any strong type of government. So because of that, they made the government very weak. It prohibited Congress from interfering in states' commerce policy. Remember, commerce is another word for trade. It prohibited Congress from taxation. In other words, it prohibited the federal government from using the people to get money. And states retained a sovereignty, freedom, and independence. Basically, at this time, the country was not really operating as a country. Each state in and of itself was really operating as its own country, and they were kind of just working together. It's kind of like how the European Union is now, how you have a whole bunch of different independent nations that are working together. It's the same type of idea. So they also had to have unanimous consent needed to approve amendments. Basically, if they wanted to make a change, Congress had to have 100% of its members approve those amendments. Now, think about how difficult that would be, right? Especially think about our Congress right now. Do you think our Congress is going to be able to get 100% agreement on anything? No, right? So this was very, very difficult for the nation to change the Constitution. So, weaknesses of the national government. So, remember that the Articles of Confederation made it so that it could not, the government could not tax the people. So, because of that, they could not raise an army. You need an army, right? Especially if you're talking about things like national defense and that sort of thing. So Shays' Rebellion basically happened because Daniel Shays and former farmers that worked with him felt that they were being treated unfairly. Basically, the nation was very new at this time, so because of that, they had a lot of debt and that sort of thing. And there was not a lot of economic security, basically meaning that profits were not guaranteed during this time. So Daniel Shays and other farmers were having a hard time being able to keep their farms because they couldn't pay the mortgage, basically. So when the banks were trying to foreclose on them, in other words, they were trying to take their farms, they rebelled. But Congress wasn't able to raise an army. We did not have a national military back then. So what ended up having to happen was the people who had money, the elites, had to pay for a militia. That's a private army, a privately paid army, to actually go in and put down the rebellion. So Congress quickly realized, and the U.S. quickly realized, they needed something that was actually going to work for the nation because it obviously was not working, right? If you don't have a strong national defense, especially whenever they were trying to fight off the British, they won. It left the window open for the British to be able to come right back in. So, the Constitutional Convention. So, the Constitutional Convention happened in Philadelphia. Remember, that's in Pennsylvania. The delegates ignored the instructions of Congress. Basically, they completely got rid of the Articles of Confederation and they started from scratch. So it was a constitution that created an entirely new form of government. And it felt that the government must be granted the power to do what was necessary to carry out its responsibilities, things like being able to make a military, right? So the founding fathers felt that they needed to create something that was actually going to serve the nation's needs. So we had the Virginia Plan, the New Jersey Plan, and the Great Compromise. So this is basically what created our Senate and our House of Representatives. So the Virginia Plan was a representation based on the state's population. This was really supported by the larger states, the ones that had a lot more people, especially the southern states, because they wanted to use their slaves to be counted as their populations. They could get more delegates. When you have more delegates, what do you have more of? You have more influence, right? So they wanted to have more influence over those smaller states. Meanwhile, the New Jersey plan, or the small state plan, they've said that each state would have one vote and it had equal power to the large and small states. In other words, under the New Jersey plan, nobody has any more say than anybody else. Everyone has an equal say in what is going on. So, what we saw was the adoption of the Virginia plan through the House of Representatives. So, our amount of people that we have for each state in the House of Representatives is based on our population. So, those who have more people in their state have more people in the House of Representatives. Senate is equal representation. So they did use this New Jersey plan just with one little small change. Instead of each state having one vote, we have two votes, which is why we have two senators in the Senate. So we also had something known as a 3/5 compromise. So basically what happened was the southern states wanted to have the slaves counted as part of their population. But the northern states were upset about this because they said, you do not count these slaves as actual people. You don't treat them as actual people. You don't give them rights of actual people. So why do you get to count them in your population? So what happened was they used what was known as the three-fifths compromise. So basically what that meant was 3 out of every 5 slaves was counted towards the population. It also prohibited until 1808 any laws involving that slave trade. So basically that is the passage from Africa to America that brought slaves over. That's the slave trade. So it prohibited Congress from making any rules regulating that until 1808. So as you can see here, up here are more northern states, places like New York, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island. They have smaller percentage of population of African Americans in their state, right? Versus these southern states, Georgia, Virginia, they had a lot of slaves as a percentage of their state population. So this should help you understand why the southern states really supported that larger state plan, right? The Virginia plan, which turned into the House of Representatives, and the northern states, why they really pushed for the New Jersey plan, which ended up being our Senate. Okay? So this whole constitution that was created was basically done in secret. And remember, they were supposed to only be amending the Articles of Confederation. So whenever they actually came out with a new constitution, people were shocked. They were taken aback because they realized that they had not just taken the Articles of Confederation and edited it. They basically had thrown it out and started anew. And the people said, we did not approve of this. We did not give you our consent for you to do this. So they were very leery of the Constitution, especially because the Constitution gave the federal government a lot more power, right? We are able to levy taxes. We are able to regulate commerce, which means regulate trade, right? Regulate treaties, all those different sorts of things that the federal government did not have power over before. So we had the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. So one way you can remember this. Federalists, right? What word do you see in there? Federal, right? They supported a strong federal government. Remember that federal government refers to the national government. So these were supporters of the strong government under that Constitution, okay? Anti-Federalists, they were the opposites. They were the ones who did not trust a strong central government. Anti-Federalists wanted to keep the Articles of Confederation, or an edited version, in place. Federalists wanted to support the Constitution. They had the Federalist Papers, right? If you've seen Hamilton, the musical, we all know that Hamilton wrote a majority of these, right? And basically what they were is they were papers, basically kind of like a information. We go onto the internet and find our information. Basically the same thing. There was a whole bunch of information and a series of essays on what the Constitution did, why, and why it should be supported. So the framers' goals, what did they want to do? They wanted to have a government that was strong enough to meet the country's needs, particularly in defense and commerce. So remember that they couldn't raise an army before, right? They needed a way to be able to defend the country, because if the country has no way to defend itself, who was to say that Great Britain couldn't come right back in and take over again? And then commerce, this was the ability to regulate trade. It wanted a government that would not threaten the existence of the separate states. This is what created a system known as federalism, which we will talk about a lot in this class, which is where we have defined responsibilities, specific responsibilities for the national government and specific ones for the state level governments. The government was restricted in its lawful use of power. So basically the Constitution made it so that way there was a very strong outline on what the government could do and what it couldn't do. It did leave some things to interpretation, which is why whenever we talk about some federal cases, Supreme Court cases, there were some debates. And also wanted a government that gave people a voice, that representative government. That is what created our Congress, okay? Also the president. So this is just a little table to help you guys out when studying the framers of the Constitution and what they wanted. So I will go ahead and skip over that, but you do have it for your reference. So Remember those basic tenets that the American government really concentrated on? Remember, one of those was liberty. Liberty meaning freedom, right? So they sought a national government that could act decisively, but not act irresponsibly. Basically, a government that could protect the country and act when it needed to, but not at the expense of taking away people's rights. So, liberty was the governing ideal they sought most. They thought individuals should be free to act and think as they choose, basically being able to act freely, right? Our ideal of individualism and being able to chase our own goals and those sorts of things. But at the same time, people should not use their rights in a way that infringed upon the freedom or the well-being of others. We'll talk about things like libel and slander. That is basically newspapers and or news channels, news stories, what have you, being limited on what they can say about someone based on the truth versus spinning a story that is completely false. Okay? So, grants of powers. So these are powers. This is that federalism system that we'll be talking a lot about this semester. Grants of power is power granted to the national government. These are specific powers granted to the national government. Okay, there's a total of 17. And then we have denials of power. So this is expressly denied to the national and state governments. And this is part of the system of checks and balances, part of the system of federalism, a system built into the Constitution that specifically denies powers to the government, specifically to protect people's liberties. So Montague's concept of separation of powers. Remember, we have 3 branches. Through those 3 branches, each branch has its own responsibilities. With that said, branches have a way to be able to check one another. In other words, they have a way to be able to control the actions of each other. So, Madison's Federalist Number 10 discussed the problem of overbearing majorities, basically saying that he felt a fear, and framers shared this fear, that those who were the majority would cancel out the voices of the minority. Basically saying that whenever a law had a majority vote, the minority did not have a voice. So he wanted to protect them in order to be able to have them still have their voices heard. So you might hear about this whenever Congress is creating different laws, different amendments. They almost always have something that has nothing to do with what they're actually talking about, what they're actually working with in that bill, and that is to get the minority voices heard. So here you have the constitutional provisions for the limited government right here. Again, you can use this table as a reference. So I'm going to go ahead and skip over it. So we have separated institutions. So that is that system of checks and balances, okay? So we have shared legislative power. So Congress is checked by the president and the Supreme Court. How? The president can veto Congress, right? Congress passes a bill, the president doesn't like it, they can veto it. Same thing with the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is supposed to act in a way that if Congress passes a law that does not follow our Constitution, they are supposed to be able to override it, basically saying, no, you cannot pass this law. It doesn't follow the Constitution. This law is null and void. We also have shared executive powers. So the president is checked by Congress. Remember, they can override that veto, right? And the Supreme Court. So remember when Trump was putting out all those different executive orders, one of them specifically prohibited immigration from different parts of the Middle East. The Supreme Court came back and said, no, that's discrimination because you're basing it off of Islamic beliefs. So that state is a strong Islamic state. You are basically saying that they are not allowed to come into the country. That is not constitutional. You cannot do that. And then the shared judicial powers, the courts are checked by the president, and that is through the president being able to appoint different officials whenever a Supreme Court justice steps down, retires, or passes away. And they're also checked by Congress because they have to approve those nominees. So this is just a chart showing you that each branch works together and they check one another. And this is a list of each of these different shared and checking powers for your reference. So, the Bill of Rights, that is the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. So basically, the Bill of Rights was written because the Anti-Federalists would not sign the Constitution. They would not approve the Constitution, ratify the Constitution, unless the Bill of Rights was added. So this is where we hear things like freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, that's the right to peacefully protest, trial by jury of one's peers, and legal counsel, that's that right to attorney, right to a jury, freedom of religion, so being able to practice your own religion, whether you want to be atheist, agnostic, Islamic, Hindu, Buddhist, Christian, what have you. And it limits the powers of the government because they cannot infringe on these rights. They cannot take away these rights. So judicial reviews. That's what we were talking about with how the Supreme Court can review what the president does and what the Congress does in regards to if these different laws and or executive orders actually pass the constitutional test. Is it against the Constitution? So who was to decide whether officials were operating within the limits of their constitutional powers? So it was decided that in Marbury versus Madison in 1803, under John Marshall, who was a very influential judge at this time, the power of the judiciary, whether a government official or institution has acted within the limits of the Constitution, and to declare its action null and void. So basically saying that whatever the president does, whatever the Congress does, people in the president's cabinet, people in the bureaucracy, people, so that's like people in the FBI, the CIA, what have you, constantly monitoring them to make sure they're actually acting within the limits of the Constitution, not overstepping. So, to the framers, there was that risk of the tyranny of the majority. Remember, that is saying that there was a fear that the majority of the people would override those who were the minority, thereby taking away their voice. So, the people acting as an irrational mob that tramples on the rights of the minority, is how your book words it. Madison said, popular democracies have ever been spectacles of turbulence and contention, basically saying that democracies tend to stoke fear and or conflict, which we have seen throughout our history. We've even seen it today, right? So, I mean, he's not wrong. So, the framers, though, nevertheless believed that the people deserved a voice in their government. So, democracy to the framers meant that a government had the majority has absolute power. So, a government in which the majority has absolute power. Remember, democracy means direct vote. We directly vote our representatives into the Congress, correct? Then we have that concept of a republic. What word do you see in here? Rep, right? Rep, representative. This is referring to those representatives, okay? So it's a government that has limits on its power, where the people have rights guaranteed by a constitution and that are protected through carefully designed institutions, federalism, checks and balances, and we also have our rights protected and our goals and or views represented within our government through our representatives. So the House of Representatives was initially the only institution based on direct popular election. So at first, the House of Representatives was the only the only section in Congress in which people had a direct vote. The Senate was not part of that direct vote at this time. It was not until the early 1900s that the people were actually able to vote in their senators under the progressives. So each state would have the same number of electoral votes as members in Congress and their electors. That's that electoral college. So basically the way this electoral college works, what they do is they take the number of House of Representatives and the number of Senate or senators a state has. They add them together, and that is how many electoral votes a state gets, which is why you see so many huge differences in the number of electoral votes that states get. And then the way it's supposed to work is that the Electoral College, and it usually does, votes whichever way the people voted for the state. So, for example, if Texas votes all Republican, then the Electoral College votes goes towards the Republican presidential candidate. If it votes Democrat, then the Texas votes goes toward the Democratic presidential candidate. Okay, so methods of choosing federal officials. So as you can see here, the president is represented. They are taken put into office by the Electoral College. Remember that is the number of votes each state has via the Senate and the House of Representatives. Their terms of service is 4 years. The U.S. Senator, the state legislator at first were the ones who put the senators into office, but then it changed early 1900s, 1913, to that popular election where the people have a direct vote into which person gets put into the U.S. Senate. So theirs is 6 years. So basically what happens is the Senate is divided into 3 sections, and 1/3 every 2 years gets switched out. So that means that basically around 13 states around there get their representatives changed out every 2 years, and they have a total of 6 years. So the U.S. representatives, they are that popular election, that direct vote. That's every 2 years, and they also do the same thing where 1/3 of them gets changed out every 2 years. They have a full term of 6 years, right? But it changes on who is in office based on that division on which state is supposed to be switched out every 2 years. So the federal judge is nominated by the president. They are approved by the Senate, and their term of service is indefinite. So usually the only way they leave office is by retiring, or passing away, or if, say, it is felt that a Supreme Court justice is, let's say, following party guidelines instead of constitutional guidelines, then they could be taken out because they are not following what they're supposed to be doing. So Jeffersonian democracy is a belief that the government belonged to all, not just the elite, okay? Saying that everyone should have a voice in their government, not just the higher class people. Jacksonian democracy urged states to award electoral votes to the winner of the popular vote. So remember, under Andrew Jackson, we had a switch. Okay, there was 2 switches under this guy. One is that the Electoral College votes had to go to whichever presidential candidate had won the state's popular vote. That was one change that happened under this guy. Another change was that all white males could vote. Prior to Andrew Jackson, it was only white property owning males. So under Andrew Jackson is whenever we saw that change. We also had the Progressive Party. They were the one who championed those primary elections, giving the people the opportunity to be able to choose their presidential candidates. Again, these were chosen by a huge influence of the parties. They chose who they wanted to run for president. But after the Progressive Party really championed their goals, it changed to the people had a voice instead of the party. The people had a voice in who ran underneath that party. So the party chooses its many candidates, right? There's usually a lot of different candidates on that ballot. Then you choose one of the ones that they gave you, and that's the people's choice on who's going to actually run for the Democratic or the Republican Party. So how the 50 states differ, political thinking through comparison. So as you can see, all of our red states are likely Republican states. A lot of these are big oil states, Bible Belt states. The blue ones, likely Democratic states over here. And then potentially competitive states, meaning they could go either way, is all these purple. Texas is actually shifting. We are becoming a potentially competitive state because if you saw in 2018 elections under the governor, you remember the name Beto, right? Beto versus Abbott, Abbott being the Republican candidate, Beto being the Democratic candidate. we saw a lot closer comparison of voting. So what I mean is, prior to that, usually the Republican candidate would get like 70% of the Texas vote and the Democratic like 30%. But it's getting closer in that now we're seeing the Republican candidate getting anywhere from like 55 to 60% of the vote and the Democratic candidate getting like 40 to 45% of the vote. So there still is a little bit of a discrepancy, but it is predicted that as our population continues to change, from people coming in from other states like California, and then also through the younger generations, which tend to vote Democratic, that Texas is going to become a swing state. So, constitutional democracy today. So, the type of government created in 1787 was called a constitutional democratic republic. It's constitutional in that the power gained through elections is to be exercised in accordance with the law, meaning that it has to be exercised within the rights of the Constitution and with due respect for individual rights. So it's democratic in that people can directly choose their senators and their representatives, and the state popular vote goes towards the presidential candidate through that electoral college, through that direct primary. And it's a republic in that our institutions, such as our Congress, have representatives that are supposed to represent our interests as a community. So today's model is a more representative government. And we have more frequent elections, which we'll talk about this in later chapters, than any other democracy. There's elections so many times a year. We have another one coming up this year, right? We have the only major democracy that relies heavily on our primary elections, those elections that actually put people into the presidential race. We are less democratic because of constitutional barriers, because of our divided branches, because of our staggered terms of office, which is that 1/3 of the Senate getting switched out every 2 years, and our separate constituencies, meaning just the different states, different viewpoints, all those different things.